Beware of false knowledge, it is more dangerous than ignorance. George Bernard Shaw. Life isn't about finding yourself. Life is about creating yourself. George Bernard Shaw. Both optimists and pessimists contribute to society. The optimist invents the aeroplane, the pessimist the parachute. George Bernard Shaw. We don't stop playing because we grow old, we grow old because we stop playing. George Bernard Shaw. People who say it cannot be done should not interrupt those who are doing it. George Bernard Shaw. Write your sad times in sand. Write your good times in stone. George Bernard Shaw. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world, the unreasonable one persists to adapt the world to himself. Therefore all progress depends on the unreasonable man. George Bernard Shaw. A life spent making mistakes is not only more honorable, but more useful than a life spent doing nothing. George Bernard Shaw. Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. George Bernard Shaw. We are made wise not by the recollection of our past, but by the responsibility for our future. George Bernard Shaw. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch which I have got a hold of for the moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. George Bernard Shaw. Some people look at the world and say, why? Some people look at the world and say, why not? George Bernard Shaw. When a thing is funny, search it carefully for a hidden truth. George Bernard Shaw. The only time my education was interrupted was when I was in school. George Bernard Shaw. Take care to get what you like or you will be forced to like what you get. George Bernard Shaw. Silence is the most perfect expression of scorn. George Bernard Shaw. The moment we want to believe something, we suddenly see all the arguments for it, and become blind to the arguments against it. George Bernard Shaw. It is the first duty of every man not to be poor. George Bernard Shaw. People become attached to their burdens sometimes more than the burdens are attached to them. George Bernard Shaw. If at age 20 you are not a communist, then you have no heart. If at age 30 you are not a capitalist, then you have no brains. George Bernard Shaw. You use a glass mirror to see your face, you use works of art to see your soul. George Bernard Shaw. Now that we have learned to fly the air like birds, swim under water like fish, we lack one thing, to learn to live on earth as human beings. George Bernard Shaw. The secret to success is to offend the greatest number of people. George Bernard Shaw. Our prejudices are so deeply rooted that we never think of them as prejudices but call them common sense. George Bernard Shaw. Liberty means responsibility. That is why most men dread it. George Bernard Shaw. It is not enough to know what is good, you must be able to do it. George Bernard Shaw. The test of a man or woman's breeding is how they behave in a quarrel. George Bernard Shaw. If there was 20 ways of telling the truth and only one way of telling a lie, the government would find it out. It's in the nature of governments to tell lies. George Bernard Shaw. The liar's punishment is not in the least that he is not believed, but that he cannot believe anyone else. George Bernard Shaw. Life is not meant to be easy, my child, but take courage, it can be delightful. George Bernard Shaw. The only person who acts sensibly is my tailor. He takes my measure anew every time he sees me. Everyone else goes by their old measurements. George Bernard Shaw. The truth is the one thing that nobody will believe. George Bernard Shaw.